Welcome to part 2 of our discussion of GoPro time lapses. Today I will be doing an in-depth tutorial on the exact settings I use to shoot incredible time lapses on the GoPro Hero 8 Black. Now I will note that if you own a different model of GoPro, a lot of these settings will still be the same and will apply to you as well. Now before I go into the actual settings on the camera, let's discuss 3 foundational principles for getting a good time lapse. First of all, you will need a tripod or a way to mount your GoPro so that it will stay perfectly still for a lengthy period of time. You want to make sure your time lapse has absolute zero camera movement. This is very important. I use a simple $20 tripod with my GoPro mounted on a quick release plate. It's nothing fancy, but it gets the job done. Secondly, you want to select a great location for your time lapse. Now, the specific location you select is going to ultimately depend on what subject you want your time lapse to feature. However, a good rule for a good location is you'll want a place where there will not be people walking in front of your camera. If a person walks in front of your camera or stands in front of your camera, that's going to ruin your time lapse in a hurry. And the third principle of a good time lapse is you want to make sure your duration is long enough. Ultimately, the length that you're shooting is going to depend on what your ultimate goal of the time lapse is. However, in general, a good length is about 1 to 2 hours. Now that may sound like a long time, but when you're taking a single photo every 5 seconds or so, that means you are getting 12 photos every minute, and you need a lot of those photos to make a really good time lapse. For example, if you're shooting a sunset like the one that I did, I had my camera set up for approximately 2 hours. I had it set up about an hour before the sun actually set, and then I left it there for approximately an additional hour so that I would get that nice effect of the darkness coming down. So now that we've got those 3 principles out of the way, let's discuss the specific best settings that I use on the GoPro Hero 8 Black in order to shoot an incredible time lapse. I'm going to present these settings to you for 3 different post-production techniques. Approximately 75% of these settings will be the same regardless of which technique you're going to choose. The other 25% of these settings will be specifically tailored to each technique. I will label each step to make sure this is clear to you. Now we're going to want to first of all power on the camera, and you're going to want to get to time-lapse mode. Once you've gotten to time-lapse mode, you're going to click on the menu button here in the center at the bottom. Now I have a couple different settings here, various custom time warp time-lapse settings. You may not have these yet if you haven't messed with it much. You're probably going to have some type of default that says time-lapse, and we're going to start with that one first. You want to click the edit button right here to the right. Now the first screen you're going to see has the lens, interval, format, output, and zoom option. This section at the top is actually going to have these settings that are very specific to which technique you are going to use in post-production. So for now, we're going to go down to the next section, which is entitled Pro Tune. Now, if you haven't turned on Pro Tune on your camera, this is where you'll want to make sure you have it turned on. These settings are the settings that unlock the keys to making an incredible time lapse. Now, the first setting here is the EV Comp. EV Comp relates to the exposure, and with the exposure we want to slightly underexpose our time lapse. The reason for that is if we do not underexpose it, any time lapses where you have sunlight involved, you're oftentimes going to get very washed out appearance on a lot of things, and you're going to lose some of that detail. Any parts of the time lapse that are overexposed, you're going to have a lot of white, but you're not really going to have the underlying details. So I recommend setting this to -0.5. And if you click on that, you can drag this all the way from -2 all the way up to +2. But the setting that I recommend for all modes is to put it at -5. I have found that this gives me the best results. The white balance is the next setting. Now white balance, I have that set to 6500K currently. That is the white balance that I have used for taking sunsets and other types of sunset or sunrise time lapses. I find that 6500 really helps me bring out some of those oranges, reds, purples, and yellows that occur at that time of day. Now the key with the white balance, whether you set it to 6500K or something else, the key is to not have it set to auto. Auto is the default on this. And the problem with auto is if you have it set to the auto, the camera is going to adjust accordingly. And it may adjust the white balance during your time lapse. And you do not want to have to work with different white balances. You want that to be consistent throughout. If you're doing one of the editing modes, you can adjust the white balance. But if you set the white balance to auto and it has several different white balances throughout the time lapse, it's going to be very difficult to give that video a uniform look. In general, you're going to want a white balance that's between 5,000 and 6,500K. The 5,000 and the 5,500K range is good for like a standard daylight scene, but the 6,500K, like I said, is great for those sunrise and sunset type shots. Whatever you do, don't leave white balance on auto. The next key setting is ISO minimum. Make sure ISO minimum is set to 100. The next setting, ISO max. Make sure ISO max is also set to 100. Yes, this will apply even if you're doing a sunrise or sunset time lapse. You want both values set to 100. The main reason is you don't want your ISO bumping up on you. Say you had the ISO minimum set to 100 and the ISO max set to 400 or 800. The ISO is going to change on you as daylight changes, and you don't want that to happen in a time lapse. That is going to really mess with the look of your time lapse. The next settings of sharpness and color, those are going to depend on which technique you want to use for editing at the end. So I'm going to skip those two settings for now, and we will come back to those. The shortcuts section here, you can customize that as you would like to. I have left that as the defaults because I don't really use the shortcuts on this camera. Now let's go back up to this upper section. As you can see, the number of settings that we have to set are actually fairly limited compared to the video modes. This is nice because it's not overly complicated to get a great time lapse. You know, you don't have to go in and change 50 different settings. So if you were looking for the option of a simple time lapse that is ready for you to share immediately out of the camera with no editing at all, you're going to make sure this is set to time-lapse video. Once you've set it to time-lapse video, the GoPro camera is going to take each individual shot and it's going to merge that into a single file for you. So at the end, you're going to have a single video that you can export from this camera in one file. And as you can see, once you select that option, the resolution changes. Previously it was grayed out, it now becomes available, and the lens setting and the interval setting also become available. So once again, if you're going to do technique number one, where you want a single file that you don't have to edit, that's ready to share, you're going to want to make sure your resolution is set to 4K. There's no reason not to get the absolute highest quality. And the lens, you have two options here. If you would like to keep it on wide, you're welcome to. It's going to get a little more width of perspective. In other words, you'll see more of the surrounding in that. However, it is going to have the fisheye effect. If you don't want the fisheye effect, the nice part about the GoPro Hero 8 Black is you can drag this down and it'll go linear. So linear mode will not have the fisheye effect. The camera will automatically correct this. When I'm doing this type of time lapse, I prefer to have it on linear because I do not like the fisheye effect, especially with certain types of landscapes with trees or structures in them. A cityscape would be a great example. You won't want the fisheye effect with all the buildings bowing inward. That would not look professional in that time lapse. So really it's up to you with this option. It depends on what you want your finished product to look like, but my recommendation is you set it to linear. The next option is interval. Now the default right here is 2 seconds. The interval is simply the interval at which the camera will take pictures. So if you leave it on 2 seconds, it's going to take a picture once every 2 seconds. So in general, the quick activity is going to be where you might have the camera set up shooting for like anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes. This would be a case where you want your finished time lapse to perhaps be no longer than 5 to 10 seconds. If you would like it to be a little longer, or if it's an extended activity, for instance like a sunrise or a sunset, where you're going to have the camera set up for about 1.5 to 2 hours, my favorite interval for this is 5 seconds. So with 5 seconds, your camera will take 12 pictures every minute. I find the 5 seconds to be optimal for most of my time-lapse shooting scenarios. 5 is kind of the sweet spot. Now, if you were going to do technique number 1, for sharpness, I recommend setting this to high. This will apply GoPro's version of sharpness, and you will not have to alter the sharpness. It'll be ready to go. And for color, I recommend setting it to GoPro Color. This is where the camera will automatically apply the GoPro color profiles to your video, and it'll be ready for you to share. So to review, these are the recommended best settings for technique number 1. This is the first set. And this is the second set. The following time-lapse is a time-lapse I shot with technique number 1. I'll put this up for 20 seconds for you to check out. I will say I'm very impressed with the quality of this time-lapse. I did not expect it to be that good with technique number 1. The GoPro color profile was quite impressive, and the sharpness was just right. It wasn't overdone, it wasn't underdone, and the EV comp of -5 and the white balance of 6500K, those all looked great as well. Let's move on to the settings for technique number 2. Technique number 2 is going to assume that you want the time-lapse in a single video file, but you want to edit that time-lapse in either GoPro's editor, Premiere Pro, or Final Cut. So with technique number 2, you're not going to change a whole lot of settings. The one setting you could change is the lens setting. If you would like to edit that, it is possible to remove fisheye pretty easily in a lot of editing programs, including GoPros and Premiere Pro and Final Cut. There are settings in each that make it easy to remove fisheye. So when I do technique number 2, I usually do shoot in wide. So I'm going to set that back to wide. And I'm going to keep my interval at 5 seconds, and my format, I'm going to keep it video. However, down here under the Pro Tune, I am going to change my sharpness from high all the way down to low. Now the reason I'm going to do that is it's much easier when you're editing to add sharpness to a video. But if you shoot with too much sharpness for your liking, depending on what you're shooting, it is very difficult to remove sharpness. So I always like shooting with low, and then I can control the level of sharpness that I introduce into the video. The other setting in this area that we're going to change is color. So instead of sticking with the GoPro color, I'm going to put this down to flat. The reason we're going to put flat there is flat is going to allow me to have much more control over the colors in the finished product. So let's say you did a shot of a sunrise or a sunset, and you would really like a lot more control over what colors get featured the most. Flat is going to be your best option because then you can selectively saturate certain colors in that video. The rest of the settings we're going to keep the same. I'm going to review here for you. These are the settings for technique number 2. This will be the top batch of settings. And these will be the bottom settings. I'm going to play another time-lapse for 20 seconds here that utilized technique number 2. This time-lapse was also quite impressive. I found it to be fun to really customize the color palette and the sharpness level to my liking. And at the same time, the EV comp set to -5, I found it useful to bring the exposure up very slightly in the finished product. Finally, we are going to cover technique number 3. Now, technique number 3 is what I call the advanced editing technique. This technique is going to be quite a bit different from technique number 1 and technique number 2. The key difference is we're going to use a format of photo. So what the GoPro is going to do is it is going to shoot one photograph every 5 seconds, but it is not going to piece those photos together. It is going to put them all as individual files, and in the final editing process, I'm going to be piecing those together. The real key option here is for the output. Make sure it's set to RAW. RAW is a special type of file format for photographs, and RAW has a lot more data available there for you to work with. So RAW is going to be much more detailed than the other option would be. The default option is JPEG. But the nice part about RAW is when you have it set to RAW, the GoPro will give you both a JPEG and a RAW file. So there will be 2 files for every image shot. Those RAW files are going to be the ones we want to work with when we piece this together at the end. Now for this, I keep the interval at 5 seconds as well. And for the settings down here, we want the EV comp at -0.5. We want the white balance at 6500K, depending on the scenario we're shooting, of course. And then we want the ISO min and the ISO max both set to 100. We want sharpness at low, and we want color flat. So those settings are not any different from technique number 2. Like I said, the main difference is those files are going to be individual images that you will then edit and piece together at the end. If you haven't done technique number 3 before, there is a lot more detail in it, but the reward is you can get a really incredible time lapse. And it gives you, the artist, a lot more control over what your finished product looks like. The time lapse I'm about to show you, I shot with technique number 3. This time lapse I shot of a sunset. What I loved about this is it brought out a whole bunch of rich details in this. For instance, you can see the various colors, lots of oranges, yellows, reds, some purples in there. You can see the rays of the sun above the clouds in several places. That is super cool. The level of detail that the RAW captures is incredibly impressive. Well, there you have it. Those are the best settings that I recommend for shooting incredible time lapses with the GoPro Hero 8 Black. I've got to say, I continue to be amazed at the quality of time lapses I can get from this camera. So in the next part of this GoPro time lapse series, I'm going to go very in depth, and I'm going to show you exactly how to edit, export, and share a GoPro time lapse. I will be covering all 3 of the techniques in depth. Technique number 1 is what I call the no edit technique. Technique number 2 is what I call the minimal edit technique, and technique number 3 is what I call the advanced edit technique. I will be covering all 3 step by step from start to finish. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please click subscribe below. Until we meet again, happy GoProing.